I didn't do what I should have to not let it happen. I've been expanding some access around the property we bought, and we had a bobcat on site. And I'm not going to disclose the operator of the bobcat, but there were stumps and piles of roots on someone else's property line, pretty much by the end of the day. And so we had a little heart-to-heart with the neighbor, and we worked it out and cleaned the roots off. But it really went along with my train of thought of like thinking about boundaries, because and you look at physical boundaries, we see the benefit of those in our relationships. You see a property boundary, you think about the old feuds of land back in like the days when it would be settlers. Like there's people that died over, property boundaries being moved and stuff like that. And so we see the peace that can be brought through a physical boundary. People can, you minimize disputes, you can utilize the full potential of your property, because if you're a little apprehensive about pushing that boundary, maybe you leave a bunch of your land undeveloped because you're not sure where that boundary is. But a clear boundary can alleviate disputes in a physical setting, and it can let you utilize your property to the full potential. And a lot of times, from my study, I'm seeing the benefit of that in our personal lives as well. A good personal boundary, defined in accordance with God's will, can help reduce disputes and help you work for God for your full potential. So like the simplest definition of a boundary is a property line. We talked about that aspect of that. Many times people that don't have a boundary spiritually or in a personal relationship can suffer from burnout and even resentment if it goes too far. So for the definition, for the purpose of the sermon and our time tonight, is that a boundary is a safeguard. It's a line that we draw in our personal lives that helps us live an effective, holy life for God, and by extension for the churches and for our families. So I think we can see that they're biblical. A lot of us wouldn't push back too hard, but if we're going to reinforce the point, we can just look at a couple things, starting in Proverbs. Proverbs is a great place to look if you want to look at this. But just to back up, because we always should approach a study of an issue from the perspective of, is it even biblical to begin with? So let's start in Proverbs. Let's go Proverbs 4, chapter 4, 23 through 27. We're going to pop through a couple of these for the sake of time fairly quickly. But 4:23 through 27, keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life. Put away crooked speech and put devious talk far from you, and let your eyes gaze directly forward and your gaze straight before you. Ponder the path of your feet, and then all of your ways will be sure. Do not swerve to the right or to the left, and turn your foot away from evil. So we see multiple aspects here where boundaries can be in place. Guard your heart. That translation is, can be keep your heart, protect, guard. You're putting protections in place for your heart because that is the source of how you act. It talks about crooked speech. You're putting boundaries on your speech. It talks about your gaze, what your focus is on, and not being towards the right, to the left, and keep your feet away from evil. So we see here as Solomon is setting up Proverbs here, instruction to his son, we see very clear admonition to put boundaries in place for yourself. Proverbs 22:6, quite a verse that we talk about quite a bit. 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go, even when he's old, he will not depart. Here's a call for parents. Have boundaries for your children. Train them in the way that he should go. And then we go down. 22:10 is an interesting verse. Probably about the closest the Bible comes to saying cut toxic people out of your life is this verse. If you wanted to, look at a verse, drive out the scoffer, and strife will go out, and quarreling and abuse will cease. So there's a concept there of, if you keep people that are scoffers and wanting to stir up strife around you, it's going to affect you there. But we see, keep on going down. Well, this is a little bit of an interesting one. It's a boundary, not one we talk about too much. But Proverbs 25:17. Let your foot be seldom in your neighbor's house, lest he have his fill of you and hate you. So I enjoy hanging out with all of you guys quite a bit, but you can get how that would come across. If someone's always, showing up at your doorstep, it's you just watch that. You might have to put a boundary in place at some point. And then in the New Testament, a very clear one that we see some fairly harsh boundaries set in place is 1 Corinthians chapter 5. This is one that we'll come back to this in a little bit, but let's read the passage. 1 Corinthians 5, verses 1 through 13. Pretty much the whole chapter has some good tips here for our thoughts tonight. It is actually reported that there is a sexual immorality among you, and of the kind that is not tolerated even by the pagans. For a man has his father's wife. And you are arrogant and ought not to rather mourn. Let him who has done this be removed from among you. For though absent in the body, I am present in the spirit, and as if present, I have already pronounced judgment on the one who did such a thing. And when you are assembled in the name of the Lord Jesus, and my spirit is present with the power of our Lord Jesus, you are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved on the day of the Lord. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival not with the old leaven and the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedies and swindlers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. But now I'm writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler. Not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from among you. So we see here a pretty extreme example. The church in Corinth had been letting someone that was actively practicing sin openly within the church dwell among them, even though he's a professing Christian and believer. And Paul said, get him, put him out. Don't let the sin of that influence your congregation, your assembly. So here we see a very clear example of Paul saying, here's a boundary. It's violating God's principles. As a church, you need to act in oneness and put him out. So then we can look at it's like Patrick. Patrick, we've been talking about David in some of our sermons recently, and he's an example of someone who had quite poor boundaries if he wanted to go to a person. We see Bathsheba. He violated personal boundaries in that situation. We see this issue of Amnon. He didn't enforce the boundary. A personal boundary is extremely violated, and David did not deal with that situation when Amnon violated that boundary there. And Absalom, David put in a very rigid boundary with Absalom. Even when he came back to visit, David did not seek that reunification when it should have been done. So there's a couple different aspects there in David's life that you can see boundaries not being enforced, being violated, or not being there at all. So I'd say, yes, boundaries are very biblical, and they're worth our time looking at it. And the last one that's a little bit more indirect before we go on is Galatians 6, verses 1 through 5. So this is one that it's good for us to look at. And there's been a couple devotionals that brought this up recently. Let's just look at it again for a couple seconds here. Chapter 6, verse 1. Brothers, if anyone is caught in transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one test his own work, and then in his reason boast. To boast, let it be himself alone and not his neighbor. For each one will have to bear his own load. So the two words that you can focus on here are bear one another's burdens, and each one's to bear his own load. Someone that has a lack of personal boundaries can often feel obligated to say yes to bearing everyone else's burdens while their own load, their daily responsibilities, are going uncared for. And so that's an issue. A lot of times it's such a good thing to bear one of those burdens, to step in and help. But if you're in a place where your own priorities spiritually for your family and your commitments that you've already made are going unfulfilled, then you're burning yourself out and you're not fulfilling this commandment here. So boundaries, you keep you effective for the faith if you can set them and keep them right. Be careful with boundaries because there can be a tendency to want to set boundaries on other people to protect yourself. Or if you see an issue, you want to bind something to someone else and then not put in the effort yourself. And so I think we can see this in the Pharisees and the way that the Pharisees acted oftentimes. They would set guidelines in place to protect the law of God, but they wouldn't keep them themselves. They would make the burden of upholding the law, they put in these hedges and stuff. They would not live it themselves. Jesus condemned that in Matthew 23, 2-4. And we'll also see an unhealthy boundary would be when you're setting a boundary to pursue your own comfort and your own interests above those of God. I think this is the tendencies you see in secularism. You see people setting boundaries in so that they don't have to deal with people that, cause them inconveniences. And this is not the extreme we want to go to when we start looking at boundaries in our own life. So, how do you set boundaries? There's different ways that you can do this, and most of what I'm saying now is not taken straight from the Bible, but it's in line with what we see. Let's imagine, got to know your tendencies. What are your tendencies at the moment? So let's imagine like 3 walls, okay? Over here, they have a gate. They all have gates in them, sort of. This wall over here, it's got no gate. There's an opening where the gate could be, but it is freely, you can pass in and out of that one. That's what we'd call a porous boundary. So there's very little control of what goes in and out of that wall there. This can be a tendency of someone who's a people pleaser, who says yes to everything. Oftentimes, this is where I found myself. I like to be helpful, but oftentimes to be helpful to the point of overcommitment. And then I got burned out, stressed, and other parts of my relationship and work would suffer because of that. So that's where, if there's a spectrum here of the 3 walls, I would find myself more on that porous boundary side. On the other side, you see someone who's like that wall has just bricks across the full opening. Okay, we have a very rigid boundary. Nothing's really coming in, nothing's really going out. There's not much flexibility there. And you're going to find someone here that has very little room for reconciliation for other people in their life. It's easy to say no because they have no guilt from turning people out of their life. It's the other extreme. We don't want to end up there. Think of David. I'd say he had a quite rigid boundary with Absalom. So he brought him back to Jerusalem, but had no desire to seek restitution. So we want to avoid that. You think of, going back to the property analogy, you think of the hermit that has his walls up around his whole property. No one comes in, no one comes out, no one benefits from what he has to offer. No, where we want to end up would be that healthy boundary where we have efforts to defend our convictions, close that gate when it needs to be closed, and remove ungodly influences when necessary. We seek reconciliation when possible. Then we can look at someone who has healthy boundaries. We'll look at Jesus. John chapter 6, he fed the 5,000. And then they were so enthralled with the amount of food that he could produce, he could feed a whole army. They tried to make him king forcefully. And he said, that's not, no. And he stepped back. And he withdrew from that because that was not his goal. That was not his mission on earth, to set up an earthly kingdom. So he helped, he taught, when they pushed that boundary of what was against his will, he stepped out of it. He took time from the people to go up the mountain by himself to pray. That's something that we should do. He helped people, but when he needed to, he stepped back. He took the time to pray and with God there. And Jesus upheld his convictions in everything he did. In his teachings, whether they were hard or not, he was willing to preach the word and to teach. Even when you see his teaching on the bread of life, he lost almost everyone except those directly around him. But it did not stop him from his mission there. So if we're going to mimic that, healthy boundaries, we need to know our priorities and our convictions very well. If you start setting boundaries from from an area where you're not convicted, you're more likely not to be able to follow through on those. A lot of times your priorities, like I'll say, I have my priorities. I got God and church and family and then work. But oftentimes I end up with just a flat. There's no tier there. And then whoever yells the loudest gets my attention at that point. And that would be a poor boundary between my priorities there. You have to be very careful to avoid that. When you're setting boundaries, you need to start with yourself. It requires you to be self-aware. Know your weaknesses, know your tendency. Do you have a tendency for porous boundaries or rigid boundaries? And then begin to work on those. It rubs me on the wrong way, and I've talked about this just a little bit before. When people try to set boundaries that are imposed on other people and expect them to uphold the boundaries, for your life. And that rubs me the wrong way. There's a place for that in extreme situations of abuse between people in a relationship, whether it's a family member or a coworker of some sorts. There could be a place for some more extreme measures, but it's outside of the scope of tonight. I'd recommend someone more qualified than me to deal with that situation. But let's look at Matthew 7. Just a little reminder here. Judge not. Verse 1, judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce, you'll be judged, and with the measure you use, will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but not notice the log that is in your own eye? How do you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there's a log in your own eye? You hypocrite, take the log out of your own eye first, and then you'll see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. I see this oftentimes. My tendency, if I have a lack of boundaries, is to blame other people on my burnout. So if I'm at work, my tendency is to blame my boss and my marketing team for bringing in too much work and overcommitting the company, when really I can see a good handful of ways that I have showed a lack of boundaries with how I spend my time, maybe how much time I talk about something at the coworker's desk, or how much time I took on my lunch break, or other things and aspects, the way that I rest so I can be focused at work. There's boundaries I can set for my life that can first help me keep up with the workload that's given to me before I start tearing down and criticizing my company. Things like that in a lot of our relationships, if you look around at your own life. So look at those first. Look how you can set boundaries for yourself, because those are the things that you can control. Yourself, your home, so forth. If you're in a situation where a boundary involves interacting with other people, be ready to remove yourself from the situation instead of forcing other people to remove themselves from the situation. There's exceptions to this rule. If you're in the home and you have a way that people need to act around your children, around your families in your home, there's a time and a place to have that person uninvited. But take that carefully. Work with, Patrick touched on this morning, with parenting. Your rules and we come up with has to be worked with your spouse. If your children, Proverbs, it's the mother and the father. They're teaching the doctrine of God. They're teaching their children to follow God in that way. Significant, if you're in a dating relationship, both people should be on board with the boundaries that you set. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to maintain any boundary at all if one of you is constantly trying to push that and have a sense of unity is not going to be there. So set boundaries with those that are going to be affected. If you're a parent, work together. If you're in a relationship, work with your significant other to set those boundaries. I found that out the hard way a little bit. When Allie and I were still just friends, some of you can remember that. I had a whole list of boundaries for our relationship that I made, and they were good, but I didn't include her in it, so there's a little bit of, I'd say just a little bit of resentment there. Not resentment, but irritation that I had set these boundaries for our relationship without engaging her in the process. So it was a smaller scale issue, but if you're setting a boundary that's very difficult to follow, if the people that are helping you enforce it are not on board, it's going to be very hard. When you communicate your boundary, you got to be prepared for pushback. Something that you think about is if you're setting a boundary, it's probably because you have that porous wall we talked about over here. So you close that gate, things will be bouncing off that wall for a little bit probably until they realize there's a wall there. I think about at the Design Alaska office here in town, there's a sidewalk that goes around the back of the building. Great spot to hang out. After everyone's out of the office, you get wanderers that come through, start doing drugs on the picnic table, all the good stuff. Behind there, really not a great place. And so they put up a fence to stop people from going by. It didn't stop people from going back there, but the fact that people couldn't go through that area anymore, it slowed people down, realized it wasn't a place they could get through anymore. And eventually you saw people coming, turning around and leaving. Sometimes they loiter on the back. And eventually they realized it just wasn't a great place to hang out anymore. And it worked. It worked. So you got to expect that pushback initially. Be prepared to have a what if, because if you don't have repercussions for a boundary that's violated, you really don't have a boundary at all. So whether you're a parent, whether you're in a relationship, you have to be ready to deal with that pushback that does come. Going back to Romans, we read Romans 2 earlier on, I believe. Maybe we didn't. I talked about boundaries that the world can set. That's just about seeking self. And it's not where we want to be. So I'd like to highlight that, like what we should be looking for in our life. Romans chapter 2, 6 through 7, as we close tonight. He will render to each one according to his works. To those who by patience and well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality, he will give eternal life. But for those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, there will be wrath and fury. So I encourage you, as you explore this topic further, there's so much to discover more on this topic. And each situation warrants a deeper study. But in what we do, we should be looking at being that person that by patience and well-doing is seeking the glory and honor and immortality with God, and not be focusing on what that we can get out of it in a self-seeking nature, because that does not end well for us in that situation. So if you have a need in this tonight, I encourage you to come forward so we can pray with you as we stand and sing.